true power is not maintained with armies. It is sustained through the complete colonization of the emotional landscape of those around you, turning their most intimate feelings into tools of your control, transforming love into invisible chains and fear into a surveillance system operating within each mind. The kings who understood this built empires that survived generations, not because they were militarily invincible, but because they had discovered something much more sophisticated: how to make obedience feel like devotion, how to turn terror into loyalty, how to weave love and fear into a braid so tight that their subjects could not tell where one ended and the other began. This was the true alchemy of monarchical power, a dark psychology so refined that its victims fervently defended the system that oppressed them, and they did so with genuine tears of love for their oppressor. Louis XIV of France understood this triad with a clarity that defines modern absolutism. When he declared, "I am the state," he was not merely making a political statement. He was articulating a psychological reality that he had meticulously built over decades. In Versailles, Louis created a permanent theater where every important French noble was simultaneously an actor and a prisoner. The diabolical brilliance of the system lay in how it transformed privilege into a form of slavery. The nobles fiercely competed for the honor of attending the king during his morning awakening. The lever, a ritual where simply being present while the monarch dressed was considered an extraordinary favor. They spent their days orbiting around the king, waiting for a glance, a word, a gesture of recognition that would validate their existence. Louis had created a psychological economy where he was the only source of value, and everyone else were emotional beggars competing for crumbs of royal attention. What made this particularly insidious was how Louis mixed love with fear in perfectly calibrated proportions. He could be dazzlingly charming, granting favors with a generosity that seemed genuinely affectionate. A noble could spend years in the desert of real indifference, and then, suddenly, be bathed in the light of royal favor, receive an invitation to the king's private table, be consulted on state matters. These moments of apparent closeness were not acts of genuine friendship. They were calculated injections of hope designed to keep everyone in a state of perpetual longing. And just when someone began to feel secure in the king's favor, Louis could withdraw his attention just as quickly, leaving the noble in panic, obsessively reviewing every recent interaction, wondering what he had done wrong, what he could do to regain lost grace. This cycle of approach and withdrawal, of warmth and coldness, created what modern psychologists would recognize as a perfect traumatic bond. The courtiers of Versailles did not only fear the king, they loved him with the desperation of addicts because he controlled the only supply of the drug they needed most: validation of their social worth. But Louis understood that manipulated love and calibrated fear were not enough on their own. They needed to be intertwined with a system of mutual surveillance that turned everyone into accomplices of control. In Versailles, privacy was impossible. Each room had multiple doors and secret hallways. The servants were actually spies, reporting every conversation, every gesture, every facial expression to a network of informants that eventually reached the king. But the most brilliant part was that everyone knew they were being watched, never knowing exactly by whom or when. This uncertainty created a state of permanent self-censorship. The nobles did not need to be constantly watched because they had become their own watchdogs, editing every word before speaking it, measuring every action against an invisible standard of what could be reported, how it could be interpreted, what the king might do if he found out. Louis had outsourced the control work, distributing it among the minds of all his courtiers, each now a jailer of himself and a potential spy of everyone else. The very architecture of Versailles was a physical expression of this psychology. The palace was designed so that everything flowed toward the center, toward the king's chambers. The nobles lived in apartments radiating from this core, their physical distance from the king a precise reflection of their position in the favor hierarchy. But this proximity was also a trap. The closer you were to the sun, the more intense the heat. The most favored nobles were also the most scrutinized, the most vulnerable to royal whims, those with the most to lose. And everyone could see this dynamic operating in others, They could observe how someone rose in favor only to be destroyed by a single wrong word, a malicious rumor, a misinterpretation of their intentions. These public falls were not system errors. They were essential features, educational spectacles designed to remind everyone that the king's love was conditional, that favor could evaporate in an instant, that security was an illusion, and the only constant was complete dependence on the royal whim. This dynamic created a particular form of collective madness. The nobles of Versailles, many of them brilliant and intelligent people, dedicated their lives to absurd rituals. They memorized etiquette rules so elaborate that a simple mistake could be socially catastrophic. They competed for honorary positions that had no real power, such as the privilege of holding the king's shirt or the right to remain seated in the presence of the queen. They spent fortunes on clothing and entertainment to maintain proper appearances, going into debt to the point of ruin because the alternative was to lose their position at court. And all this time, their true powers as aristocrats, their authority over their own lands, their political independence, were systematically eroded. Louis had turned them into actors in his perpetual theater, so consumed by the drama of court life that they did not notice how their substantive power was disappearing. They had politically neutralized them by making them psychologically addicted to their presence. This control technique, through forced proximity and competition for affection, repeats throughout history with fascinating variations. Catherine the Great of Russia operated with a similar understanding of how to blend love and fear, but with additional refinement. Catherine cultivated the image of an intellectual and sophisticated lover of art and philosophy, corresponding with Voltaire and Diderot, positioning herself as an enlightened monarch. This facade of cultivated sensitivity made her cruelty, when it emerged, even more devastating because it was wrapped in the language of reason and progress. She could destroy a political rival while quoting philosophers. She could order the brutal suppression of a peasant revolt while discussing human rights with her European correspondents. This dissonance between her public self-image and her actual actions created psychological confusion in those around her. They couldn't simply fear her as an ordinary tyrant. They had to navigate a much more complex reality where the sovereign they admired for her intellect and supposed benevolence was also the same one who could be ruthlessly cruel. Catalina also understood erotic power as an additional dimension of control. Her lovers were not simply personal gratifications. They were carefully selected political instruments. Men like Grigory Potemkin not only shared her bed, but became extensions of her power, handling crucial aspects of government while remaining entirely dependent on her continued favor. The mixture of sexual intimacy, political power, and emotional dependence created extraordinarily strong bonds. These men could not simply serve Catalina from a professional distance. They were intertwined with her on multiple levels. Their power derived directly from their physical and emotional proximity to her. And when she ended a lover, as she inevitably did, the fall was total. They not only lost sexual access to the Empress, but also lost their political position, their purpose, their identity. Catalina had fused the personal with the political so completely that separating the two dimensions became impossible. Love and fear were no longer distinct emotions. They were aspects of a single immersive experience of being in the orbit of an absolute sovereign. Catherine's court operated with the same mutual vigilance as Versailles, but with an additional element of justified paranoia. Russia in the 18th century was a place where palace coups were not only possible, but common. Catherine's own husband, Peter III, had been overthrown and subsequently murdered under circumstances that clearly involved his complicity. This violent origin of her reign meant that Catherine lived with the constant awareness that others could do to her what she had done to her husband. This paranoia was both her weakness and her strength. It made her ruthlessly vigilant, quick to perceive and eliminate threats. But it also meant she could never fully trust anyone, that every relationship was tinged with suspicion, that even her closest lovers were potentially conspirators. And this distrust seeped through the entire court, creating an atmosphere where everyone knew that everyone was potentially treacherous, where loyalty was a performance that had to be constantly demonstrated because it could never be genuinely believed. But perhaps no monarch calibrated this triad of love, fear, and obedience more precisely than Henry VIII of England. What makes Henry particularly fascinating is how his own psychology evolved over time, becoming progressively more narcissistic and paranoid, and how this altered the balance of the Triad. Young Henry was genuinely charismatic, athletic, intelligent, and musically talented. The people around him could love him without that love being purely strategic. There was something authentic in his charisma, something that inspired genuine loyalty. But as he aged, as his body deteriorated and his ego swelled, fear began to dominate the equation more and more. By the end of his reign, being close to Henry was to be in constant danger. His 6 marriages, 2 of which ended in execution, demonstrated that even the deepest intimacy offered no protection. What Enrique illustrates particularly well is how a monarch can use romantic love as a tool of political control. When he became obsessed with Anne Boleyn, Henry was not just desiring a woman. He was testing the limits of his power, seeing if he could reshape reality itself, challenge the Pope, fracture Christendom, simply because he wanted something that existing rules said he could not have. And when he succeeded, when he finally married Anne after years of struggle, he had not won a wife. He had won confirmation that his will could reshape the world. But Anne, the real woman, became a problem. She could no longer remain the perfect symbol of his triumph because she was human, complicated, with her own desires and flaws. And so Enrique did something psychologically revealing. He retroactively reinterpreted his entire relationship with her. The woman he had risked everything for became, in his revised narrative, a seductive witch who had deceived him. He destroyed her, not despite the love he once felt, but precisely because that love had been so intense. Enrique could not admit that he had been wrong, that he had judged poorly, that he had risked so much for something that turned out to be ordinary. So Anna had to become extraordinarily evil to justify his original choice to pursue her and his subsequent decision to destroy her. This pattern was repeated with variations throughout her life. Catherine Howard, his 5th wife, was barely a teenager when she married the aging and physically repulsive king. When she was accused of adultery, Henry's response was revealing. She cried publicly, presenting herself as a victim of female betrayal. But simultaneously, he orchestrated her destruction with bureaucratic coldness, ensuring that every legal aspect was perfectly documented, that her execution was indisputable. Henry needed to be both the wounded victim and the relentless judge. He needed his court to see him suffer, to validate his pain, to confirm that his brutal response was justified by the depth of his emotional wound. This theater of wounded vulnerability was another mechanism of control. Enrique's courtiers not only had to fear him, but also had to comfort him, validate his feelings, confirm that his most cruel actions were understandable responses to intolerable provocations. Enrique had turned his emotional fragility into a weapon, making his capacity to feel hurt as dangerous as his ability to execute. Henry's court operated under what can only be described as normalized terror. Thomas Cromwell, one of his main ministers and architect of many of his most important policies, faithfully served for years, only to be executed when he was no longer useful. Thomas More, a friend of decades and one of the great intellectuals of his time, was beheaded for being unable in conscience to support Henry's break with Rome. The list of people close to Henry who ended up executed is so long that it becomes almost absurd. And yet, people continued competing for positions close to the king, continued risking everything for a moment of royal favor. This was not simply stupidity. It was the result of a system where the rewards of royal favor were so enormous and the alternatives to being at court so limited that rational calculation led people to enter into relationships they knew were potentially suicidal. This dynamic reveals something fundamental about how absolute power works. It does not need to be consistently cruel to be terrifying. In fact, inconsistency, unpredictability, is often more effective than constant cruelty. When a ruler is predictably brutal, people can at least develop avoidance strategies, can calculate risks, can protect themselves by staying away. But when a ruler alternates between extravagant generosity and capricious cruelty, when the same behavior can be rewarded one day and punished the next, then the only survival strategy is constant hypervigilance. People around such rulers live in a state of permanent anxiety, always trying to read signals, anticipate mood swings, position themselves correctly for any version of the ruler that may emerge at any given moment. This constant anxiety is cognitively and emotionally exhausting, draining the mental resources that could be used to resist or question. People in this state have no leftover energy for rebellion. All their cognitive capacity is consumed by the task of immediate navigation. The three monarchs, Louis, Catherine, and Henry, illustrate different calibrations of the same basic triad, but the underlying pattern is consistent. They all understood that sustainable power cannot be based solely on force. Force can buy obedience, but it is a fragile obedience that disappears as soon as the threat is withdrawn. True control requires colonizing the internal emotional landscape of your subjects, making your presence so omnipresent in their minds that they obey you even when you are not watching, even when obedience goes against their own interests. And the way to achieve this is through careful manipulation of love and fear, never allowing one to dominate completely, always maintaining the tension between the two. Love creates emotional dependence. When people love their leader, when they crave their approval, when they measure their own worth by their proximity to power, then their obedience does not feel like submission. It feels like devotion, like loyalty, like something they do voluntarily because they want to maintain the relationship they value. This is the deepest control, when the chain is invisible because it is made of affection. But love alone is not enough, because love can fade, can be transferred to other objects. Then fear enters as the stabilizing element. Fear ensures that even when love wavers, even when people begin to question, they still obey, because the consequences of disobedience are too terrible. And obedience, the third element, is both the result and the reinforcement of the system. Every act of obedience reinforces the habit of obeying, makes the next instance of submission easier, and gradually erodes the ability to imagine resistance. What makes this particularly insidious triad is that it is self-sufficient. Once in place, it perpetuates itself without requiring constant conscious effort from the ruler. The subjects watch each other, compete for attention, internalize the rules until self-censorship becomes automatic. The ruler can then withdraw partially, become less visible, and the system continues to function because it now exists within the minds of all who participate in it. It becomes culture, in the unwritten norms that define how people interact, in the expectations they have about what is possible or permissible. And these norms are transmitted to new generations, who learn from the beginning how the game works, how to compete for favor, how to navigate the mixture of love and fear, how to obey in a way that seems like choice. But the persistent question is whether this pattern is simply history, whether Luis, Catalina, and Enrique are figures from a past we have moved beyond, or if the mechanisms they employed are still relevant. The uncomfortable answer is that these patterns are everywhere in modern forms. The charismatic CEO who creates a corporate culture where employees fiercely compete for his attention, alternating between effusive praise and devastating criticism, making his approval the currency that defines value in the organization. The political leader who cultivates an intense emotional connection with his followers, presenting himself simultaneously as strong and as a victim, demanding personal loyalty beyond politics. The romantic abuser who mixes declarations of love with subtle threats, making his partner feel special and terrified at the same time, creating dependency through the alternation of affection and cruelty. These are echoes of the same dynamics, adjusted for contemporary contexts, but operating on the same psychological principles. The reason these patterns persist is that they explore fundamental vulnerabilities of the human psyche. Humans are social animals who need connection, approval, and belonging. These needs are not optional weaknesses that we could eliminate with enough willpower. They are core features of our neurology, products of millions of years of evolution, where group exclusion meant death. Effective manipulators, whether absolute kings or modern abusers, exploit these wired needs, offering to satisfy them while simultaneously using them as levers of control. And because these needs are genuine, Because the longing for connection and approval is real, the resulting control feels less like oppression and more like a complicated relationship worth maintaining. The most disturbing thing is how this system can make victims defend their oppressors. The courtiers of Louis XIV wrote about him with genuine admiration. Catalina's discarded lovers often maintained a nostalgic affection for her. Even some of Henry's victims, while awaiting their execution, wrote declarations of loyalty to the king. This is not masochism or stupidity. It is the logical result of having internalized the system so completely that your identity is fused with it. When you have invested years or decades of your life competing for the favor of a ruler, when you have measured your worth by your proximity to power, when you have defended the ruler's actions to others as a way of defending your own choices to serve, then admitting that the system is fundamentally corrupt would require dismantling your own self-image. It is psychologically easier to continue believing in the system, even when it is destroying you, than to face the abyss of meaning that would open if you admitted you had dedicated your life to something worthless. This is the final victory of the Triad, when it no longer needs to force obedience because its victims have chosen it voluntarily, when love and fear are so intertwined that they cannot be separated, when oppression has become identity. The kings who mastered this psychological alchemy did not need large armies to maintain control. They had something more powerful, a population that had become the guardian of its own prison, defending the bars as if they were support structures rather than confinement. And the system could perpetuate itself generation after generation because each generation reinterpreted it as tradition, as culture, as simply the way things are. The final question is not whether such systems existed. The question is how much of your own life is structured by variants of this same triad. In what relationships do you mix love with fear? In what contexts do you compete for approval from figures of authority? How much of your obedience feels like choice, but is actually the result of years of subtle conditioning? The palaces have mostly disappeared, but the psychological patterns that animated them remain alive, migrating to new contexts, adapting to new power structures. And the reason they continue to be effective is that most people never recognize them operating in their own lives. The most perfect control is the one that feels like freedom. The most complete obedience is the one experienced as voluntary devotion. The most paralyzing fear is the one wrapped in promises of love. If you have reached the point where you can no longer distinguish between what you do out of love and what you do out of fear, then the Triad has achieved its goal. And the only way to start untangling this knot is to ask yourself, if the person or institution you seek approval from disappeared tomorrow, who would you be? And do you feel that question as liberation or as a loss of identity?